The prison walls sweated with silence on the night before his execution, the kind of silence that weighed down the air and pressed against the lungs. Somewhere far down the corridor, a clock ticked, slow and merciless, its rhythm keeping time with a life that was almost finished. In a small cell at the end of the block, the condemned man sat at a metal table, his wrists free only because there was nowhere left for him to run. His face bore no fear, no regret, only the smug satisfaction of someone who had walked through years of trial and appeal with arrogance, still clinging to his skin. He had killed without reason, without mercy. A young woman from a town that had once embraced him as one of its own had been taken by his cruelty. It had not been a crime of passion or a desperate act. It had been deliberate, premeditated, done with the kind of smile that could make a man look less than human. Now, the law had run its long and winding course, and the morning promised a finality no lawyer could delay. Yet before the dawn, before the straps and the needle, there remained a tradition older than justice itself, the final meal. When the guard came to his cell, pen in hand, the killer smirked as though the world still owed him one last indulgence. He asked for steak, cooked rare so it bled onto the plate, mashed potatoes slick with butter, a bottle of bourbon to burn down his throat, and pecan pie like his grandmother used to make when he was a boy. He spoke the request like a king issuing an order, savoring the control it gave him over something, anything, in the last hours of his life. But beyond those gray walls, in the small kitchen tucked within the prison's heart, others were waiting. The family of the woman he had murdered had carried their grief through years of silence. They had watched justice crawl forward, had swallowed rage until it turned to something colder, sharper. They did not shout in court, nor spit at him when he was led past in chains. They had waited for this night. When the warden received their unusual request to prepare the meal themselves, he hesitated only long enough to confirm there was no law to forbid it. Perhaps he felt pity for them, perhaps he recognized the weight of their pain. Whatever the reason, the request was granted. The kitchen became their quiet battlefield. The father worked the skillet, flipping the steak until its juices sizzled. His hands trembled, but he kept his jaw tight. The mother mashed the potatoes until they were smooth and rich, her tears falling silently into the bowl, stirred in with butter and salt. The brother rolled out the crust for the pecan pie, pressing the edges with care that made his knuckles go white. They spoke little, each action carried out in heavy silence, as though the act itself was their only language left. They plated the food with precision, not as an offering, but as a weapon he would never see coming. When the tray reached his cell, the killer grinned wide, teeth yellow in the dim light. He tore into the steak with ferocity, juices dripping down his chin. The potatoes disappeared under his fork, the bourbon burned its way down his throat, and the pie crumbled sweet on his tongue. He ate like a starving man, shoveling it in as though the world would end once the plate was clean. And perhaps, in his mind, it would. When the last crumb was gone, when he leaned back in his chair licking his fingers with satisfaction, the guard stepped forward. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion, as he delivered the words he had been ordered to say. "Your meal was prepared by the family of the woman you killed." For the first time that night, the killer's face changed. The smirk faltered. His eyes shifted as if searching for some escape from the taste that still lingered in his mouth. The food curdled in his stomach, his throat worked as though it had turned to stone. He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked and died, leaving only silence behind. The family did not come to see him in the death chamber. They did not want to watch the straps tighten across his arms or the plunger depress. Their revenge was not in the act of death itself. The law would see to that. Their revenge had already been served, quietly, in the form of a plate of food that stripped him of his final comfort. They gave him everything he wanted, and in doing so, took from him the illusion of power he clung to until the end. He lay awake until dawn, every bite replaying in his mind, each flavor now poisoned by the thought of their hands, their grief folded into every spoonful. When the guards came to lead him down the long corridor, his steps faltered. His arrogance was gone, his face pale, his eyes haunted by something no executioner's hand could do. The story of his last meal spread beyond the walls, whispered first among prison guards, then carried out into the town he had scarred. Some said it was cruel, that the family had tainted a tradition meant for mercy. Others said it was justice, truer than the gavel and the verdict. The family spoke of it to no one. When asked, they lowered their eyes and remained silent. But in the privacy of their home, a kind of balance had returned. The father no longer reached for the gun he once swore he would use. The mother, after years of closing her daughter's door, began leaving it open again. The brother, once consumed by rage, learned to breathe without it choking him. The killer's last hours became a tale carried in hushed voices by guards working the night shift. They spoke of how his hands shook as he was strapped down, how his lips moved without words, how the smirk that once defied the world had vanished. He had been broken not by law, not by death, but by the strange revenge of a family who had learned how to turn their grief into something sharper than hate. Years later, when the prison closed and the buildings were left to rot, stories clung to its halls. Some said the kitchen held a chill, as though sorrow had seeped into the tiles. Others swore that in the cell where he had eaten, you could still hear the scrape of a fork on a plate, followed by silence heavy enough to crush the air. The family aged in quiet obscurity. They never sought recognition, never answered questions. They didn't need to. Those who had lost someone to violence understood, without words. The tale lived on, not in newspapers or courts, but in whispers that carried through time. The tale of a killer who had been given everything he asked for, and in the end, found himself poisoned not by food, but by memory. His last meal was not remembered for the steak or the bourbon or the sweetness of pie, but for the bitterness that clung to his tongue until his final breath. And in that bitterness, the family finally found the silence that had eluded them for so long. The prison smelled of rust and stone that night, a damp heaviness that clung to every surface. The guards walked with slower steps, their keys jangling faintly, their faces harder than usual. Death had a way of seeping through the air before it arrived, filling the corridors long before the man was led to his end. Everyone felt it, but no one spoke of it. The condemned man had not been broken by years inside. If anything, he seemed to thrive on the notoriety of his crime, taking each appeal and delay as another stage for his smirk. He would look at guards and lawyers with the same expression he wore in the courtroom, a twisted half-smile that suggested he knew something no one else did. It was the smile of a man who had never truly felt remorse. When word spread among the prison staff that the family had been allowed to prepare the final meal, even the guards grew uneasy. Such requests were rare, almost unheard of. Some whispered that it was cruel, that grief had made the family savage. Others thought it fitting that the killer's last taste of life should come from the very people he had wounded most. Still, none of them would have dared to deny the family after all they had endured. In the small, sterile kitchen, the family worked with silence as thick as grief itself. The mother's hands shook as she trimmed the fat from the steak. Every slice of the knife brought memories of her daughter's laughter, memories she had locked away because they hurt too much to hold. The father salted the meat with deliberate movements, his jaw clenched so tightly that veins stood out in his neck. He had once thought of killing the man himself, had imagined loading his old hunting rifle and ending it in an instant. But time had forced him into a colder patience. Now, as the smell of cooking meat filled the air, that same rifle felt like a ghost in the corner of the room, a threat never needed. The brother, younger than the killer, had grown up with rage burning inside him. He had been forced to live in the shadow of his sister's absence, to watch his parents bend under grief until their backs almost broke. As he rolled out the pie crust, he pressed harder than necessary, his knuckles white, as if each push into the dough was a way of burying years of anger. He sprinkled sugar across the top not as decoration, but as punctuation, an act of finality. The warden stood in the doorway, arms folded, his face unreadable. He watched them work, but said nothing. It was not his place to interfere. Perhaps he felt pity. Perhaps he believed this act might finally give them peace. Or perhaps he only wanted to see what would come of such a strange arrangement. When the tray was carried into the cell, the condemned man's eyes lit up. The steak glistened under the dim light, The bourbon in its bottle gleamed amber like liquid fire, and the pie sat golden and perfect, dusted with sweetness. He chuckled to himself, as though the world had granted him one last triumph. "Now that's a meal fit for a king," he said, his voice thick with mockery. He ate with greed, tearing at the steak as though it had wronged him. The juices dripped onto the metal tray, and he dragged the potatoes through it, shoveling them into his mouth. He drank deeply from the bourbon, letting it burn him warm. When he reached the pie, he slowed, savoring the sweetness, the taste of a home he had destroyed with his own hands. The guard who delivered the message later said he had never seen a man so satisfied, so self-assured, until the words were spoken. "Your meal," the guard said flatly, "was cooked by the family of the woman you murdered." It was a simple sentence, nothing more. Yet it hollowed the man instantly. His fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against the tray. He looked at the food as though it had transformed into poison. His throat worked, his lips parted, but no sound came. The bourbon soured in his gut. The pie turned to ash on his tongue. For the first time in years, his smirk vanished, replaced by something small, almost human: fear. The hours that followed were restless. Guards passing by his cell reported hearing him pacing, muttering under his breath, his arrogance stripped away. He had nothing left but the memory of that food, now haunted by the thought of grief folded into every bite. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the family's hands preparing his last pleasure. He had eaten their sorrow, swallowed their anger, consumed their silence. And it had consumed him in return. When dawn came, he did not stride down the corridor with his usual swagger. His steps were hesitant, his head bowed. The guard strapped him in, and they noticed his hands trembled. Some said he tried to speak, to say something before the end, but the words never found his mouth. The smirk that had carried him through years of trial was gone, erased by a kind of revenge no executioner could deliver. Outside the prison, the family sat together in their quiet home. They did not celebrate. They did not cry. They simply breathed in a way they hadn't in years. The father rested his hand on the table without clenching it into a fist. The mother opened her daughter's door for the first time in a decade, letting light spill into the room. The brother walked outside, without rage pressing against his ribs. The town whispered about the meal for years to come. Some said it was cruel, others called it justice. The prison guards told the story on night shifts, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward shadows. They spoke of how the man had changed in his final hours, how his strength seemed to crumble under the weight of something as simple as food. Long after the prison closed, people swore the kitchen held a chill, as though sorrow had seeped into the walls. Some claimed that if you stood in the condemned man's cell and listened long enough, you could hear the scrape of a fork, followed by silence. The family never explained themselves. They didn't need to. For them, the revenge had never been about spectacle. It had been about taking back something small but vital: control. They could not undo what had been done. They could not bring back their daughter. But they could give him what he wanted and make it mean something he could never escape. And so the tale endured, whispered like a cautionary prayer, that a killer's last meal could be more than food, that grief could be served cold, and that the most devastating revenge could be carried not in violence, but in silence. His death was inevitable, but his undoing began the moment he lifted the fork to his lips. The night before the execution stretched on endlessly, a night thick with unease. The prison itself seemed to sense what was coming, its old bricks exhaling drafts of cold air, its pipes clinking as though restless. The guards avoided lingering near the condemned man's cell, not out of pity, but out of contempt. They had spent years watching him walk with that same swagger, seeing that same smile curl across his lips whenever reporters scribbled his name. He had killed a girl in a small town, shattered a family, and carried himself afterward as though it had been nothing more than a game. The townspeople still remembered the trial. The courthouse had been packed so tightly that people stood in the aisles, whispering prayers and curses. The mother sat in the front row, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles bled where her nails dug in. The father sat beside her, shoulders tense as though a single word could drive him to leap across the room. The brother had been younger then, his face burning with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. And all the while, the killer sat in his chair, wearing that smirk. He seemed amused by it all. The witnesses, the tears, the evidence piled against him. Even when the guilty verdict was spoken, he did not falter. He only tilted his head and smiled wider. Years passed between that verdict and the night of his last meal. The appeals dragged on like a cruel echo, each one forcing the family to sit through more hearings, more paperwork, more delays. Each time they left the courthouse, the mother would return home and sit in her daughter's room, staring at the bed left untouched, the walls frozen in a time that no longer existed. The father would go outside and stare at the barn where his daughter had once played, unable to step inside without seeing her ghost in every corner. The brother learned to live with the rage like a second heartbeat, always pounding, always there. But grief does not only hollow, it reshapes. Over the years, the sharpness of their pain transformed into something else. They no longer dreamed of revenge in the form of violence. They no longer wished to see him beg or scream. They wanted something subtler, quieter, something that would cut deeper than any blade. They wanted him to taste them. Not their blood, not their pain, but their presence. They wanted to leave a mark that would crawl into his soul and linger until the very end. And so, when the request was made to the prison, it came not with threats or shouting, but with calm persistence. The warden was a man hardened by decades of executions, but when he saw the look in the mother's eyes, he did not refuse. He allowed them to prepare the meal. He told no one why. The night of the cooking became its own kind of ritual. The kitchen was cold and sterile, but as the stove hissed to life, it filled with the smell of butter, meat, and sugar. For the family, it was not just cooking, it was communion. Every slice of the knife, every stir of the spoon was infused with years of silence, grief, and fury. The father seared the steak until its juices hissed and popped, the mother whipped the potatoes until they were smooth, and the brother carefully poured bourbon into the glass, the amber liquid catching the light like a cruel joke. The pie came last, its sweet, nutty smell filling the room. The mother's hands trembled as she set it down on the tray, her eyes fixed on the golden crust. It was the same pie her daughter had loved as a child, the same dessert she had begged for on birthdays. Now it would be eaten by the man who had stolen her life. When the tray reached the cell, the killer laughed. He saw the meal, rich and heavy, and for the first time in years, his smirk broadened into something almost joyful. He tore into the food with hunger, chewing noisily, bourbon burning down his throat, pie sweet on his tongue. He leaned back in his chair when the plate was clean, licking his fingers, utterly satisfied. Then came the guard's words. "Your last meal was cooked by the family of the woman you murdered." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. His grin collapsed. His eyes darted to the tray, to his hands, to the crumbs on his lips. His face paled, his throat tightened, and the satisfaction drained from him like water from a cracked cup. He tried to laugh, but the sound broke apart. He muttered something under his breath, too faint for the guard to catch, and turned his face to the wall. That night, the killer did not sleep. Guards reported hearing him whispering, pacing, clutching at his stomach as though the food had turned on him. He muttered curses, pleaded with no one, and struck the wall with his fists until his knuckles bled. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, above the sorrow he had caused. But in those last hours, he realized he had swallowed more than a meal. He had swallowed their grief, their fury, their silence. And it ate away at him from within. By dawn, when the guards came for him, he was pale and trembling. The swagger was gone, the smirk erased. He shuffled down the corridor like a man already dead, his eyes hollow. When the straps bound him to the gurney, he did not fight. When the curtain rose and the needle pricked his arm, he did not smirk. His lips quivered as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. The family was not there to watch. They sat in their quiet home, the silence no longer heavy with grief, but with something else, relief, perhaps, or balance. The father set his coffee on the table and did not clench his hands. The mother walked into her daughter's room and opened the window to let in the morning air. The brother stood in the yard, breathing deeply, for once without rage burning in his chest. The town spoke of the story for years. Some called it cruelty, others justice. But those who knew grief understood it without question. The killer had been broken not by the law, not by the execution, but by the simple, devastating act of a family who had turned their sorrow into a weapon sharper than steel. And so the tale spread, not in headlines, but in whispers. Guards told it to new recruits. Townsfolk repeated it in hushed voices. The prison, long after it closed, was said to carry the memory in its walls. In the old kitchen, they said you could still smell pecan pie on the air, and in the condemned man's cell, you could sometimes hear the faint scrape of a fork, followed by silence. The story lived on because it was more than vengeance. It was proof that grief could be transformed into something colder, more lasting, and that sometimes the deepest cut was made not with violence, but with kindness twisted into a blade. The killer's last meal was not remembered for its taste. It was remembered for the silence that followed, the silence that devoured him, the silence that gave a family back their breath.